Hi, welcome back. Our previous lesson was on equilibrium, where we combined the demand and the supply curve to get our equilibrium price and equilibrium quantity. Today, we'll be looking at how shift in the demand and the supply curve affect equilibrium price and equilibrium quantity. We saw from our previous class that the intersection of market supply and demand curve determine the equilibrium quantity. For example, we have a curve here, and this is the supply curve and this is the demand curve. At point A on this curve is where supply equals demand, and this point is our equilibrium point. Corresponding price, example, P star is our equilibrium price and Q star is our equilibrium quantity. Now remember that the demand curve summarizes people's current buying plans, but if those plans shift, then so would the market demand curve. So let's first look at what happens to equilibrium price and quantity when there is a shift in the demand curve. So the question we are asking here is that how does market equilibrium change when demand shifts? Before we move to answer that question, let's highlight some factors that cause a shift in the demand curve. Some of these factors include the income of the consumer expectations, price of related goods, number of buyers, and preferences. So any of these factors can cause a shift in the demand curve to the left or to the right. First instance here is an increase in demand. Let's assume that we start from this demand curve, which is our old demand curve. And any factor in the market, apart from the price of the good, causes the demand to increase. In this case, it's going to shift to the right. So there's a shift in our demand curve from our old curve to our new demand curve. Consequently, that moves us from equilibrium point A to a new equilibrium point B, which is a new intersection between our new demand curve and the supply curve. You can see that this is going to cause prices to increase and quantity demand to also increase. So when demand increases, equilibrium price will increase and equilibrium quantity will also increase. Now let's look at a decrease in the demand. If we start from an old demand curve represented as this curve, and any factor listed above in the market changes, that shifts our demand curve to the left. We move from the old demand curve to a new demand curve. That moves us from equilibrium point A to a new equilibrium point B, which is the intersection of our new demand curve and our supply curve. That results in equilibrium price reducing from 3 to 2.5 and equilibrium quantity reducing from 4 to 3. Now, what we have here is that an increase in demand shifts the demand curve to the right, creating a new supply equals demand equilibrium, which increases the price from 3 to 3.5 and increases the quantity demand from 4 to 5. Alternatively, a decrease in demand shifts the demand curve to the left, creating a new supply equals demand equilibrium, decreasing the price from 3 to 2.5 and also decreasing the quantity from 4 to 3. So what we have to note here is that an increase in demand leads to higher prices and larger quantities, and a decrease in demand leads to lower prices and smaller quantities. We could get a caveat here to say that demand shift leads price and quantity to move in the same direction. So when demand increases, price and quantity both increase, and when demand decreases, price and quantity both decrease. Now we can see that in both curves, it's just the demand that is shifting. But our new equilibrium point is showing a movement along the supply curve. And similarly for when prices reduce. Now this movement along the supply curve, which leads us to a new equilibrium, is created because of the price change. When demand increases or demand shifts to the right, a new equilibrium point here shows a higher price and a higher quantity. Now at a higher price, producers are willing to sell more at this price. As we said before, the law of supply says that higher prices induces higher supply. So a shift in demand will cause prices to increase, which will also induce suppliers to increase their supply and consequently lead us onto a new equilibrium point B. And it's the similar case for when there's a decrease in demand. When demand shifts to the left, it leads us to lower prices. At this lower price, suppliers are willing to sell less of the product, causing a movement along the supply curve from point A to point B, which consequently gives us a new equilibrium point at point B. Now let's look at what happens when there's a shift in the supply curve. A shift in the supply curve is when the supply curve moves to the left or to the right. The market supply curve summarizes sellers' current selling plans, and if any of those plans shift, then so will the market supply curve. Now, we have talked in detail in our previous lessons about the factors that shift the supply curve. But to summarize, these are some of the factors that can shift the supply curve to the left or to the right. The number of sellers, when the number of sellers change, the price of inputs, technology or productivity, and sellers' expectations. So a change in any of these factors can cause the supply curve to shift to the left or to the right. Now, let's first consider when there's an increase in supply. If we start from equilibrium point A, which is shown using our old supply curve and our demand curve. At this point, price is 3 and quantity is 4. If any of the factors listed above changes in such a way that it induces suppliers to increase their supply of the good, then it's going to cause this supply curve to shift to a new supply curve here. Now this moves us from equilibrium point A to equilibrium point B. At this equilibrium point B, we see that prices have reduced from 3 to 2, but quantity has increased from 4 to 5. Let's look at the flip side where there is a decrease in supply. If we begin from our old supply curve, at this point A, prices are 3 and equilibrium quantity is 4. If there's any shift in the market that causes producers to produce less of the good, this will shift the supply curve to the left and take us to a new curve which we can call a new supply curve. This brings us to a new equilibrium point B. At this equilibrium point, prices increase from 3 to 4 and quantity reduces from 4 to 2. So we can see that an increase in supply leads to lower prices and larger quantities. However, a decrease in supply leads to higher prices and smaller quantities. Now, just as we said before, a shift in the supply curve will also induce movement along the demand curve. Even though only the supply curve has shifted, changes in price will induce a movement along the demand curve. For instance, when there's an increase in supply and the supply curve shifts from the old supply curve to the new supply curve, we find that that brings us to point B, where we have lower prices. At lower prices, the law of demand states that consumers are going to buy more. So this induces a movement along this demand curve, which consequently brings us to a new equilibrium point B. And similarly for when there's a decrease in supply. When we move from equilibrium point A to point B, we find that there's higher price, which is represented by an increase in prices from 3 to 4. When prices increase, consumers buy less of a good. This is shown by a movement along the demand curve, consequently bringing us to a new equilibrium point B. So what we have here is that shift in supply leads price and quantity to move in opposite directions, while a shift in the demand causes price and quantity to move in the same direction. So this is all that we have for our lesson on how shift in the demand and supply curve affect equilibrium price and equilibrium quantity. In our next lesson, we will be looking at a simultaneous change in the demand and the supply. If you enjoyed today's lesson, consider subscribing. Thank you.